Continuing from our last shir, we had mentioned that when the Brisa describes what the holiday of Chanukah is like, it mentions two prohibitions. It mentions a prohibition against eulogizing, the lo lemispaid bahon, and also a prohibition against fasting, the lo lihisanos bahon. And Rav Kook explains that true success, whether it's on a personal level or on a national level, has to contain both elements of spiritual success as well as material success. Because living here in Olam Hazeh, in this world, we are not meant to completely do without the material, and we are certainly meant to infuse our lives with the spiritual, not only to be content with the material. And therefore, he points out that eulogizing, if somebody passes away, that causes spiritual pain. And fasting is something which causes physical pain. And on Chanukah, when we are celebrating our success, so the celebration has to include both physical as well as spiritual joy, and therefore we are precluded both from eulogizing as well as from fasting. Probably the most famous question ever asked on any Gemara is why the Gemara says that the mitzvah of Chanukah lasts for 8 days, if after all the miracle was only 7 days, because there's enough oil to let burn 1 day. So the first day is not a miracle. There are literally hundreds of answers given to that question. I just want to share something that Yismach Moshe says, because I'm going to try to give a little bit of background, at least to my understanding of what he means. We just read the other week in the Haftorah about the miracle that occurred when a woman came to the Navi Elisha and said that my husband died, leaving tremendous debts, and the debt collectors are coming to my door and threatening to take my children. And Elisha told her, do you have anything in your house? And she said, I just have some oil. And he said, take the empty containers of oil, and start pouring from the oil in the flask. And as long as she had empty containers and she was pouring, so the oil kept on coming. So what's the big deal of the miracle of Chanukah that the oil lasted for 8 days? It's not the first time we've had a miracle in our history of oil lasting a lot further than it should have. But the Yismach Moshe explains that this was oil that had been carefully measured and sealed and put away, enough oil to last for 1 night. And the Gemara tells us elsewhere that a bracha, a miraculous blessing, does not come upon something which is measured. Anything which has already been counted or measured is not eligible for a miracle. And so therefore, you couldn't have over here the same type of miracle you had by Elisha, that the oil keeps on coming, because that would have been a miracle in terms of the quantity of the oil. And once the quantity was measured, it cannot be increased. And that's what Yismach Moshe says. The miracle was that when they burnt the oil, only 1/8 of it burnt each night. That since there couldn't be a quantitative miracle, there was a qualitative miracle. And since the first night only 1/8 of the oil burnt, even though the entire quantity should be burnt, the result is that every single night there was a miracle. I think I mentioned once beforehand that one of the somewhat challenging parts of just learning the Ein Yaakov rather than learning the Gemara is that the Ein Yaakov is just picking out the agadic portions, and sometimes it really skips those parts which make it obvious why this was brought in here. So just to give you a little bit of background information to understand at least the pshat level of why the next piece was brought. The Gemara had brought down from Rav Kahana a halacha in the name of Rav Nassan bar Minyumi, who said over from somebody by the name of Rav Tanchum. And he had explained that a Chanukah candle, as well as the schach for your sukkah, as well as if you're creating just to make it simple, not to get into the details, if you're creating an eruv and you're using a string or a beam to symbolize the eruv, that it cannot be more than 20 amos, somewhere between 30 and feet off the ground. That's the halachic portion of the Gemara, which is not brought down in the Ein Yaakov. Then the Ein Yaakov says, Amar Rav Kahana Darash Rav Nassan bar Minyumi Mishmei Rabbi Tanchum. My dirsiv, what does the pasuk mean when it says, in the context of Yosef being tossed by his brothers into the pit, v'habor reik, that the pit was empty, ein bo mayim, there was no water in the pit? Well, it sounds a bit repetitive. Mimashma shenemar v'habor reik, from the understanding of when the pasuk says that the pit was empty. Ein yodea, don't I know, she'ein bo mayim, that there is no water? So why did the pasuk find it necessary to also mention there wasn't any water? Elama talmud lomar ein bo mayim. So what is it teaching us when it says that there was no water? That mayim ein bo, that there was no water in the pit. Avol nachashim v'akravim yesh bo. But in the pit there were snakes and scorpions. So the question that bothers many of the commentators is, why is this Gemara brought down over here in the middle of a discussion about Chanukah, and why all of a sudden are we talking about the empty pit into which Yosef was thrown? So an answer that's brought down in the name of the Gra, it's brought down also by the Torah Tamima, is that, being as we had just mentioned, that you cannot have your Chanukah candles or your sukkah or your symbol for your eruv more than 20 amos high. Why not? So the reason is because any one of those three things, their purpose is they should be visible. You light Chanukah candles so people should see them. Your schach of your sukkah is meant to remind you of the fact that we built sukkahs on our way out of the land of Egypt. And if you can't see the schach, you're not going to have that reminder. And the symbol of the eruv is supposed to be a symbol. So if you don't see it, it's not symbolizing anything. And once it's more than 20 amos high, it's something that will not be noticed by people. So in the same way, the brothers had put Yosef in the pit in order to save him. They decided not to kill him. They were going to do something else with him. And they put him temporarily for safekeeping in the pit. But the question would be, well, if they put him in the pit and they saw there was no water, well, why did they put him in there if there were nechashim va'akravim, if there were snakes and scorpions? But that's why it's brought down over here, to bring out the point that they couldn't see that there were snakes and scorpions, because the pit itself was more than 20 amos deep, and therefore they were unaware of the dangers that lurked at the bottom of the pit. There is, however, an interesting Zohar that seems to understand things differently. The Zohar in Parshas Vayeshev, where it brings down the story of Yosef and his brothers, Rabbi Yitzchak says that if there were snakes and scorpions, So why does it say that Reuven put him in the pit in order to return him to his father? Why wasn't Reuven worried that the snakes and scorpions, which again the Zohar is assuming Reuven was aware of them, unlike the explanation we just gave. So why did Reuven put him in the pit? And why does it say he put him in the pit in order to bring him back to his father? He put him in the pit. He's going to go ahead and get bitten by the snakes. He says that Reuven saw that as long as he was in the clutches of his brothers, he was likely to be killed because his brothers hated him and wanted him dead. So Reuven says it's better to throw him into a pit with snakes and scorpions rather than giving him over to the hands of his enemies who will not have any mercy on him. And from here, Chazal say that a person is better off to throw himself into a fire or into a pit of snakes and scorpions rather than allowing himself to be given over into the hands of his enemies. Why? Because the Zohar explains that if the danger is snakes and scorpions, if he's a righteous person, then Hashem might perform a miracle. And we know different stories where our ancestors were saved, and maybe some person would show up and save them from the pit, or something would happen. But if someone is given over into the hands of their enemies, it is very unlikely that they will be saved. And that's why the pasuk says, in order to save Yosef miyadam, from their hands. It doesn't just say to save him, but to save him from their hands, because getting him out of their hands and putting Yosef in a different type of danger made it more likely that he would ultimately be saved. Thank you for watching. And again, if anybody is interested in contributing to the sponsorship of these shiurim, please be in touch with me. Have a great evening.